You know, Mika, our good friend Rick Stingel wrote something yesterday I agree with completely. He said, I'm kind of dumbfounded by the journalistic pivot away from the Mueller report, said Rick Stingel, a former Time managing editor who served as Undersecretary of State in the Obama administration. If someone gave you a brief synopsis of War and Peace written by a hostile critic, do you think then that you have read the book?
No.
And it is fascinating that, of course, I understand why Donald Trump and why the RNC and why all these people who are desperately clinging to the Barr letter are doing so. But even as the National Review said, it's an interlude. We haven't seen the Mueller report.
Yeah.
And that's something that the American people have to be told every second of every day, because we still don't know what we don't know.
And we're waiting for it, and we're covering it, but there are other stories to cover, like why they would defund Special Olympics and then put it back, or what is the reason the government took so long to work with Boeing to ground those jets. There are stories to cover, and we'll get to them, along with covering the drumbeat to get to the Mueller report, which we haven't seen yet, and nothing exonerates this president. That's the one thing we know from it. That's the one quote out of the report, is that this is not a complete exoneration, which the president is loudly using the platform of the presidency to brand the latest Barr summary as an exoneration. It is not, and we will continue to cover that. Joining us now, White House bureau chief at The Washington Post and analyst for MSNBC and NBC News, Philip Rucker. Philip, you're reporting on how the president dodged an interview with Mueller and the fight over whether to have him subpoenaed. Did he dodge the interview? What happened there? Why did Mueller not sit him down?
Yeah, well, Mika, it's one of the big mysteries of this Mueller investigation, and perhaps we'll find some answers when we eventually read that report. But what we know from our reporting is that from almost day one, the president's lawyers were determined not to let him do an interview with the special counsel because they knew if he were to sit face-to-face with federal investigators, he would probably lie, which is committing perjury, which is a crime. So they were trying to protect the president from doing that interview, and they went to extraordinary lengths to do so. There was a multi-pronged campaign to try to pressure the Mueller team as well as the Department of Justice with legal arguments about executive privilege. This was all going on while Rod Rosenstein, who oversaw the probe at the Department of Justice, was under a lot of public political pressure from the president, from Republican allies in Congress, some of whom were even calling for him to be removed from his office. And ultimately, we know that Mueller never formally sought that subpoena, but what we don't know is the extent to which he and Rosenstein and others at the Department of Justice were debating whether to have a subpoena, whether to force and compel the president to do that interview.
Well, we certainly know that Donald Trump's own lawyers were afraid of Robert Mueller.
Yeah.
I suspect they just thought that Donald Trump couldn't keep up with him. And Jonathan Capehart also, his lawyers admitted to Bob Woodward that they didn't want foreign leaders reading the transcript because foreign leaders would think that Donald Trump is so stupid that they could take advantage of him.
Well, I don't know where to go with that. But, you know, Joe, this has been one of the things about this presidency that's been most confounding. But, Phil, let me ask you a question about this story, which is pretty incredible. And you have a key line in here that I think people need to understand, because we've been comparing the Mueller investigation to, say, Ken Starr's investigation of President Clinton during the Monica Lewinsky situation. And you have in here that in assessing whether to pursue such a high-stakes move, that is sitting down, subpoenaing the president, the special counsel was not operating with complete autonomy. That was a contrast with Ken Starr, who investigated Clinton and had broad leeway under the now expired independent counsel statute. Why is that so important?
Well, it's really important because Robert Mueller was not an independent counsel. He was a special counsel who reported up through the Department of Justice to the Deputy Attorney General. And in fact, the Deputy Attorney General, Rod Rosenstein, wrote a letter to the Congress in the middle of this investigation reminding them that Mueller was a subordinate, that this was not an independent special counsel, and that the Department of Justice oversaw it. So if Mueller wanted to force the presidential interview by issuing a subpoena, he would have had to have gotten approval approval from his superiors at the Department of Justice, and they are political appointees of the Trump administration who were under their own political pressures from the Congress as well.
Philip, my concern is if at the end of the day Trump was never interviewed, unless there was a silver bullet, you had to get the state of mind or motive to understand, get behind conspiracy collusion. So without interviewing him and without that absolute tape recording of him and Putin where he says, okay, you take Ukraine, I'll take the tower, that without interviewing, without establishing motive or state of mind, you were never going to get to collusion.
That's right, and legal experts say that the interview was even more important for the obstruction of justice part of the investigation, because in order to prove obstruction of justice, the prosecutors needed to fully understand the president's intent. Now, they interviewed witnesses, they interviewed people who interacted with the president at these moments, they interviewed reams of documents, but they did not interview the president himself to understand his intent, and that was a gap in this investigation that perhaps the report will shed further light on.
One thing we can never forget also is that there were 219 criminal charges and 5 prison sentences as a result of this, as Trump takes his victory lap.
Yeah, no victory at all for those that have worked with him and worked around him. Many are in jail, others going to jail. All right, Philip Rucker, thank you so much for being with us. Tom,
thank you.
You know, I read your sad tale every day on Twitter. You travel far too much. You give far too many speeches. You write far too many columns, and you are home for far too short a time. That said, the teeming masses want to know. They deserve to know. What are you turning your brilliant intellectual power towards this next week? What are you focusing on?
Well, like everybody else, I'm really hoping that I actually get to see the Mueller report. I get to find out what's actually happening in the country. I mean, I was out of the country for almost a week, and I don't think I learned any less than anybody else who was following the news, even though I was 5,000 miles away. So in the coming week, I'd actually like to catch up and find out what's going on.
Yeah. What's your take on the Attorney General right now? Is he just covering up for Donald Trump?
I think it's unfair at this point to talk about a cover-up, but I think what he did over with the report was he seized the narrative. That was his job. He knew that in the next 24 hours, whatever he said was going to become the story, and that would be what the president said, and that's what 30 to 35% of the American people are going to believe. If the president says this settles it, I've never had any inappropriate contact with Russia, which none of this says, by the way. That people would believe it, and I think the word that Adam Schiff used and Joe, you used a moment ago, was about compromise. I never expected the Mueller report to have that silver bullet in it. I think people who did made a mistake. But the thing I'll be looking for in the coming week or two, I'm very curious about the counterintelligence aspect of this investigation, not the particular legal finding. The legal finding is very narrow, but there was a whole lot of counterintelligence work that was done. Now, some of that we may never know about, but that's what I'm really curious about, and that's what I'm looking to hear more about.
And Jonathan Capehart, what are you going to be working on over the next week?
Well, actually, I have a big series, 2-month series that hits next Thursday, following leaders from the civil rights movement with Congressman Lewis, Clarence B. Jones, who is Martin Luther King's lawyer, lots of narrative episodes, interviews with people. Some folks people know, many they don't know, but stories that will illuminate their understanding of probably one of the greatest moments in the country's history.
Amazing. All right. Jonathan Capehart and Tom Nichols, thank you both for being on this morning. And
Thanks.
Coming up, a new investigation by the Washington Post reveals how Donald Trump, as a businessman, repeatedly inflated his net worth to potential lenders and investors. David Farenthold joins us with his new reporting on that. Plus, New York Times opinion writer Bret Stephens explains why he says the president's critics in the media should start operating under the assumption that Trump is a genius. Morning Joe is back in a moment.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.